Hello everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at storing and retrieving JSON in a Postgres database in Ruby on Rails. This seems on the surface like it'd be an easy task, and then you actually try it and then it's a complicated task, and then it seems like you figure it out and it's easy again, and then it becomes complicated again. So basically what we have to do is we have to tell it what type of column this needs to be, which is going to be a JsonB column because it's a feature in Postgres, which we can do through Rails, which is easy enough. But then the issue becomes, how do we query this? So right here you can see that we have grids with top left start nodes, and I have I think the top left start nodes I'm looking for here are any grids where the start node is set to 2,2, which is this one. Which isn't technically top left because I then created these, but we can see here that the start node here is 2,2. And if I click on this, it should take me to that grid. So after you figure out how to query it, then again, it feels like you figured out what the issue is. But then when you go to update it, you then realize that if you try to edit the form, you sort of have to JSONify it and then parse it on the back end again. So that's where things can get a little bit complicated. But I'll walk you through it. It shouldn't be too difficult. So we're going to go ahead and stop the server, hit Control L, CD out of here, and then we'll do a Rails new, we'll call it video, and then we'll just do a -d for Postgres. So that allows us to create our Postgres database. Now, of course, there is a similar option, I believe, with SQLite, but your column's not going to be a JsonB column. It's going to be just a regular JSON column, I think. And then for SQLite, your query is going to be structured differently. But hopefully you can use sort of what we cover here to do similar behavior. So to get started, we're going to go ahead and generate a scaffold. We'll call it grid, and we'll give the grid a payload of type JsonB, just like that. We can then go ahead and do a Rails G stimulus. We'll create a stimulus controller and call it the grid, just so we have something to render this on. We can then go ahead and do a code dot to open this up in VS Code. And we'll start by seeding the database because it's a little bit confusing what the grid actually needs to look like. It's just something I threw together for the sake of an example. It's not necessarily the best way to structure a grid. It's just the way that I got it structured. So what we're going to do is in our seeds file, we start off by creating a payload, which I'll just copy over here. And I'll have a link to the code in the video description if you want to follow along. But basically, you create a grid. The grid can be n by n. It doesn't really matter. And then you just give it a number, and the integer in here corresponds to the color. So a 0 is going to be, I guess, all white. A 1 is going to be all black. A 2 is going to be your start node. That's going to be green because it's RGB. So the G is FF, which is the highest number, which means we have the most green. And then the end node or the goal node is going to be 3, which is going to be FF as the first one, which means it's going to be red. So again, it's not necessarily the best way of doing this. It's just what I came to throw together from the start. Now, to actually use this, what we do is we have this payload here that we've structured, and we sort of mimic what we want it to look like. And then we can come down here and we can create the grid. And then we can pass in the payload if we'd like to, just by doing something like this. And then when I save this, my formatter will get rid of it because that payload's actually optional. You can just pass it in like that. And then we can create a similar grid. This is just going to be a smaller grid, I guess, that we can iterate through. So for this one, we just pass in a hard create where we pass in the payload. And again, this is just going to be structured however you'd like it to be in the back end. And then we pass in a grid where we have the start node in the top left, the end node in the bottom right, and then maybe a 0 and a 1 there, so we see those. We tell it that the start node is at 0, 0, because of course we're not reading through this, unfortunately. Then we tell it the end node is down here. So you do need to make sure your start and your end correlate to where they are in here. It's a bit of duplicated data. It's just to give us something to query by, I guess. You could also just search by the color of the node maybe, or the value of the node. But okay, that gives us our data. We can now go ahead and run our migration and our seed, and we can do that by first doing a db:/drop, because I probably already have a Postgres database set up, which I did. And then we can do a Rails db:/prepare, and that should do our database creation, our database migration, and then our database seeding. We can check this by running a Rails C. We can grab the grid.first, and that'll give us back our grid data. So here you can see all of this is stored inside of a payload column. We can now do something like grid equals grid.first, and then grid.payload gives us the payload. And then we can do something like grid.payload. I don't know, start node. Except that doesn't work. So this is where you run into the issue for how do you actually query this? Because, you know, having it stored in the database is fine. But what happens if we want to figure out where the start node is? For that, what we can do is we can say something like, I don't know, get start node, and then we can check where the start node is located. So maybe we want to see where, like the grids where the start node is located at 0, 0, right? So we get this, we set it equal to a grid.where, and then inside of quotes, let me just close this so we can keep it neat and organized. We call payload because that's what the column that has the JSON inside of it is called. And then we do one of these, which you can either do 2 angle brackets or 1 angle bracket. Really doesn't matter. We can do 2 here. This is probably the syntax you're going to see the most online. And then we just check for whatever we're looking for. So in this case, we called it the start node right here. So what we'll do is inside of single quotes, we'll say start underscore node. And then we say this is equal to, and then the value we want to search for. Now this could either be something that's like heavily nested, where it's like your start node is your row, and then inside of your row is like your column or whatever. Or in this case, what we'll do is we'll just say it's an array, and we know that we're looking for, I think I said 0, 0 is what we wanted. And then we wrap it inside of single quotes. Oops, we wrap it inside of single quotes. And then we close it with the double quote there. So this should give us back something. It gives us back some result. So now let's do get start node.count, which is 1. And then we have grid.count, which is still set to 2. So if we grab the start node.count, we can check out what it has. And the start node here is set to 0, 0. Which is what we were searching for. Now we do know that we have the other grid, right? So the grid.all, we have the other grid where the start node is set to 2, 2. So let's try to do something where we get the start node and it's set to 2, 2, and that gives us back something. Now we can do the get start node and we can just check, and this is the 2, 2. So we know we're selecting it at least. So that's kind of like the harder part. So now let's take this and let's convert it into something we can actually use. So I'm gonna go ahead and start the Rails server with the Rails S, go over to localhost port 3000 so we can see this pretty little picture for the millionth time. Come over to config, go into routes, hit Control B to hide the side panel, and set the root to be the grid's controller and the index action. So it'll take us to the grid creation page. So there's our JSON being displayed on the screen. That's very neat. Now let's go ahead and let's create the stimulus stuff. So we'll come into our app, we'll come into our views, our grids, and our grid partial. Inside of our grid partial, the only thing we really need to do is create a content tag. It's going to be for a HTML canvas with nothing inside of it. Pass it some data. The controller here is the grid controller we created, which is our stimulus grid, which in our JavaScript controllers grid right here correlates to this JavaScript. So we can run this JavaScript and it'll be attached to this div. We then pass in the grid payload, which is our grid.payload, which is just whatever's inside of here. Could be anything. Now, of course, because you're using this JSON, wherever you're using this payload, you're going to need to do some kind of validation or be really sure that the data is not going to be dirty, because you can pretty much put whatever you want in here. And if you're just operating under the assumptions that your users are going to input the correct data, you're probably going to have a bad time. But okay, this gives us the appropriate controller stuff. So now we can open up our web dev tools with Control-Shift-I, and then we can scroll in a bit into our console. So let's make sure this is working. Let's come into our grid controller, hit Control-B again, and let's just console log out something to make sure that we are actually connected to this element. So now if we refresh, we'll see 2 of these. One is for our grid's payload up here, and another one is for our payload down here. So for each of our partials, it's rendering its own stimulus controller. That's pretty neat. Let's come into the top one right here, and then if I refresh, we'll see that we only have that one displaying. So now we want to grab the payload data that we've set on here, which we can see right here is this data-grid-payload, which is coming from our grid payload right here. And remember, this does need to correlate to whatever your controller is called, I believe. So you're going to have grid_payload, which is what's going to allow us to come in here and do something like this.payload equals JSON.parse for this.data.getPayload. At this point, you can then go ahead and try to console log the this.payload, refresh the page, and we can see it gives us back the actual JSON structure right here, which is pretty cool. So this now allows us to do whatever we want to with it, right? At this point, like pretty much tutorial over in terms of what the JavaScript is going to do, because you can just go watch any other JavaScript tutorial and it'll probably cover it far better. But what we're going to do is we're going to grab the colors in the grid from this object because we now have direct access to it. And then we're going to grab the canvas element and we'll grab the context for it. We can grab it with this dot element because remember, it is actually the stimulus controller is attached to a canvas itself, which is what this dot element is grabbing. It's whatever the stimulus controller is attached to. So in this case, the this dot element is the canvas. So we can then call this dot canvas dot get context, and it works just like you would expect it to. We can now set the canvas width and the canvas height to be equal to the grid.length and then the grid.length again. This is grabbing the first element of it, which is going to be the length of however long these are. And then you're going to have that by however many of these you have is how you're getting your width. And then this is just kind of like your node size. So you could say const node size equals 10, and then you could replace each of these with the node size. So that's just saying it's 10 pixels by 10 pixels, right? So the width or size in pixels. Again, pretty standard stuff. Now we just call this dot draw grid, which is going to be a method we create down here. And in this function, all we really do is we say draw grid for I, for j, and then this is just iterating through it all. We then grab the node, which is equal to the whatever the ith and jth element in the array is, which is going to be like 0 or 1 or the 2. And then depending on what that is, if it's a 0, 1, or 2, we access the colors array, because remember in our seeds, our colors are 0 is white, 1 is black, 2 is green. So we grab 0, 1, or 2 in our colors array, and then we get white, black, green, or red. We then set the fill style to be that color, and then we say for the fill rect here, we define the width of the node again. So maybe this should be like this dot node size, and then we can grab this and come down here and maybe do some cleaner coding, even if it does cause this to expand into the next zip code over. So we can do all that. We can come over here and we can refresh, and now it's going to tell us that this dot node size is not defined, even though it clearly is up here. So let's come over here and let's refresh, and let's add it to both of these. And there we go. So now we get the same grid we had before. If we click back now, you'll see it's also working for our weird little grid down here. It might be a bit hard to see. But okay, the reason why we have this little grid right here is if I click on this and I click edit this grid, we can see it looks a little strange. So the first thing I want to do is come into our form for this. That's going to be inside of, I should probably make sure I say this, app, views, grids, and form.html.erb. So inside of our form here, what we want to do is first of all, change this from a text field to a text area so we can see it a bit better. We then want to add in a value, which is going to be our grid.payload.toJSON. So we do that. Now, now if we come over here and we refresh, we can see it's stored as an actual JSON thing, or it's being displayed like that. If we get rid of this value and then we save it, you'll see that it looks vaguely similar. Because it kind of is. And the problem that you really run into here isn't necessarily with how this is being displayed. So what I'll do is I'll come back to the grids. I'll create a new grid. It's going to have null in here by default because there's no data. And I'll click create grid. And that seems to work just fine, right? Now, if I come in here to our third grid and I click edit and I paste in our grid again, it works just fine. But you'll notice very kind of sneakily, if you click edit, this is actually a string. So if we now click update, it's going to break. And this is what I meant by it sort of gets easier to deal with, and then it gets more complicated again, where you're running into these weird little edge cases that can be kind of annoying. So the way to fix this is your value here is fine. It's not really necessary, but your issue is going to be once you get to the back end, which is going to be in your controllers, your grids controller, you're going to have to make sure that you are properly updating. So in our update method down here, what we can do is we can grab the payload by parsing it out. So we call JSON.parse on the params grid payload, and then we set the @grid.payload to be equal to that payload. And then we can do something like if @grid.save instead. Now, of course, this does mean you're going to have your params here So you might need to like remove the params for the payload when you do your updating of the grid, right? So your options are either to convert this from your params or to do your saving in a different way. So it's ultimately up to you how you do this. You can do something where you do like your at grid dot update with the params, the grid params dot accept the payload, and then update it like this, or do your I guess in this case you have to do something like your grid params down here has these, but then you have to like convert it down here before you get to it. In my case, the easiest way to do this is to just call the grid payload and then update it like this, and then call at grid.save, because this is a pretty small app, but it's going to really depend on how you want to handle it. So now if you come over here and we edit this, actually I'm going to come back to the working one and grab this one. So click edit, copy this, come back, and then we'll come down to this one. Now if we show this, edit this, paste this in, click update, you'll see it's updating just fine. So now if we click update on this grid, it is once again working. So that's sort of how you can handle this. Now for the final step, let's query these for any grid where it's located at 2, 2. So we already saw that earlier. Basically all we have to do is up here in our index, we can create some kind of weird variable with like at start nodes equals, and then you can do something where you grab the grid payload. Now here it's suggesting to do an at grids.map for the grid and then the grid payload. This isn't what we want though, right? So instead what we want is that grid.where we had earlier. And then let me just copy and paste this because you don't want to watch me type this. We grab the payload and the start node and we check for where the start node is 2, 2 to get that specific type. We can then grab the start nodes, come into our grid index page, which is going to be down here. And then in our grid index page, we can just loop through those start nodes real quick, maybe at the top right here. So we just say, here's our JsonB nodes, grids with top left start nodes, or I guess the grids with 2, 2 start nodes. And then instead of what we have here, because I named it something differently, we can just replace it like this. So we say at start nodes.each do grid, and then link to show grid with the grid inside of it. We then come over here, refresh the page. Here's our grids with a 2, 2 start node. If we click on this, we expect to go to this grid. So we click on it and we go there. Now we can come up to our controller again, right? And instead of having the 2, 2 start nodes, let's grab the 0, 0 start node. We'll come back to our grids, refresh. We now have 2 of them because we have 2 down here. And if we click on one of these, it takes us to one of those grids. And that's effectively all you really have to do to make this sort of work with your system. Now, again, it's going to be a bit more nuanced. You might have some nested stuff to deal with, but these are sort of the core concepts. So if you're using something like, I think we used the Ahoy gem for analytics before. We used it in like the Linktree course as well. There are instances where you have this like this user session and you have to like get into the nitty gritty of like the nested fields inside of your JSON. And in that case, we had to do something similar where we had to come in, we had to grab the payload, and then in the payload, we had to grab like the user ID and then the device type they were looking for inside of that, for example, or like the session ID or whatever it was. So there are cases where this is relevant. It's not always relevant, but I just thought I'd cover it in the event that it ends up helping someone. So yeah, hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully I will see you in the next tutorial.